The night Harlow Dunn got fired, the temperature outside was 9 degrees. Not cold enough to make the news, just cold enough to matter. He had been standing in the loading dock of the Asherton Grand Hotel, the one on Michigan Avenue, the one with the gold-lettered awning that people photographed on their way to somewhere better, and he was holding a mop the way a man holds something he has held 10,000 times before, without thinking about it, the way breathing works. A banquet was happening on the 14th floor. He could hear the elevator music filtering down through the vents. Something classical played by someone who didn't understand it. Harlow Dunn set the mop against the wall. He did it quietly. He always did things quietly. That was the first thing people got wrong about him. Reginald Asherton III, that was actually what it said on his business card. The third, like a king who had decided to go into commercial real estate, had built the Asherton Grand with his grandfather's money and his father's reputation and exactly none of his own talent. He was 54 years old. He wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he wore them the way men wear suits when they want you to understand something about the distance between you and them. He had a way of looking at service staff that wasn't quite looking. More like registering. The way you register a chair or a potted plant, useful in its place, invisible otherwise. The banquet on the 14th floor was his. A private gala for the Asherton Foundation, which was, in practical terms, Reginald's vehicle for receiving awards about philanthropy from the same circle of people who attended his parties, 260 guests. Senators, media executives, a former cabinet secretary. The kind of money that had existed so long it had stopped thinking of itself as money and started thinking of itself as order. There was a Steinway concert grand in the corner of the ballroom, rented, white. It sat near the window that overlooked the lake, positioned so the light would catch it just right for photographs, which was the only reason it was there. No one had been scheduled to play it. That detail matters. Remember it. Harlow Dunn had come to the hotel 11 months ago. He came the way a lot of men his age come to jobs like that. Not because he had no other options, but because the options he'd once had were gone, and the particular grief of losing them was something he carried privately, the way men of his generation were taught to carry things. Pressed close, not discussed. He was 51. He was 6'1", broad across the shoulders, with hands that were large and slightly calloused and moved, when he was thinking, in small unconscious patterns against his thighs. Like he was tracing something. Like his fingers remembered a shape his mind had tried to set down. He had grown up in Memphis, seventh child of a woman who cleaned houses and a man who drove a postal route for 31 years, and never once called in sick, not once, because he believed that showing up was a form of dignity that no one could take from you. Harlow had believed that too, once. He mopped floors. He polished brass fixtures. He restocked the supply closets on floors 2 through 7, and sometimes, when the overnight man called out sick, he did floors 8 through 14 as well. He did it without complaint, not because he had nothing to complain about, because complaining in his experience cost energy he needed for other things. The other workers liked him. They called him H. He brought coffee for people on cold mornings without being asked. He fixed a younger man's bicycle chain once in the parking garage with nothing but a pen and a piece of wire, and the younger man talked about it for a week like he had witnessed a miracle. Harlow never talked about what he used to be, not to them, not to anyone in that building. The gala started at 7. By 9:30, the 14th floor was the kind of loud that expensive rooms get loud, a specific frequency of laughter and crystal and self-congratulation. Reginald Asherton moved through it the way he moved through every room he owned, which was to say slowly, with the confidence of a man who had never been told to hurry up in his life. His wife, Camille, walked at his elbow. Camille Asherton was a thin woman with excellent posture and eyes that were always doing a calculation you weren't privy to. She smiled at every guest, remembered every name, and said nothing that could ever be used against her. She had survived 22 years of marriage to Reginald by being indispensable and unknowable in equal measure. The issue began at 9:47. One of the catering staff, a young woman named Rosa who had been working doubles for 3 weeks and was running on approximately 4 hours of sleep, had sent word downstairs that the ballroom's side entrance near the kitchen needed clearing. A spill, the kind that happens when a tray and a moment of exhaustion meet each other. Harlow got the call. He took the service elevator to 14. He came in through the side entrance with a cart, moving the way he always moved in occupied spaces, carefully, peripherally, with the practiced invisibility of someone who understood that his presence was meant to solve a problem, not create one. He was clearing the last of it when it happened. He passed the Steinway. He didn't plan to stop. He wasn't going to stop. He had never, in 11 months, done anything in that building that wasn't within the precise boundary of what he was supposed to do. But the piano was open. The fallboard was up. The keys were exposed. And something in Harlow Dunn's hands remembered before his mind had a chance to decide. He set one hand on the edge of the keys, not playing, just contact, the way you touch the shoulder of someone you love without thinking, just because they're there. His fingers found a chord. He didn't know he was going to play it until it was already played. It was a single phrase, 12 seconds, maybe 15. Something his teacher had taught him 40 years ago in a narrow room in Memphis. Something the old man had said was the right way to greet a piano you hadn't seen in a while. Like saying hello to a friend whose number you'd stopped calling. Respectful. Brief. Except it wasn't brief, because once his hands were there, they remembered everything. They remembered the 87 performances. They remembered the 4 years at the conservatory and the decade after that, and the recordings and the stages and the names of the concert halls in the order he had played them. His hands were 51 years old, and they moved like water, like no time had passed, like the 11 months of mop handles and supply closets were a dream he had almost convinced himself was his real life. He played. He didn't know how long enough that a waiter near the kitchen entrance stopped moving, long enough that 2 guests near the window turned, long enough that the room, this room of 260 people, senators and executives and old money and new money, went quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet when something is happening that no one planned for and no one can explain. Long enough for Reginald Asherton to hear it from across the room. Reginald had been mid-sentence with a man from his investment group when the piano started. He turned. He saw the white piano. He saw the man in the gray maintenance uniform seated at the bench, head slightly bowed, hands moving across the keys with a fluency that was. And this was the part that made something twist in Reginald's chest, with a fluency that was better than anything he had arranged for this event, better than the quartet he'd hired for cocktail hour, better than the background recordings playing on the speakers he'd paid $4,000 to rent. He started moving across the room before he had fully decided to. He reached the piano in 40 seconds. He planted himself to the right of the bench between Harlow and the guests, and he stood there until the music stopped. Which it did. Not because Harlow saw him, but because Harlow finally looked up and found the room watching him, and felt the specific gravity of having forgotten where he was. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Reginald Asherton said, in a voice that carried because he had never learned to modulate it, because he had never had to, "Who authorized this?" Harlow stood, slowly, the way men stand when they are deciding what kind of moment this is going to be. "I apologize," Harlow said. "I was here for a cleaning call, and I didn't ask what you were here for." Reginald stepped closer, not touching, close enough that the distance between them was a statement. "I asked who authorized you to put your hands on that instrument." "No one," Harlow said. "I shouldn't have." "I'm sorry. Your maintenance," Reginald said. The word came out of his mouth the way words come out when someone uses them to mean something else. "That instrument costs more than you'll make in 5 years. You don't touch it. You don't sit at it. You don't breathe near it without someone telling you it's part of your job." He paused. He looked at the people watching him. He made a calculation about the room. "Get back to your floor." Harlow Dunn did not move immediately. That was the second thing people got wrong about him. They assumed because he was quiet that he was also small, that his silence was the silence of a man who had no internal landscape, no history, nothing beneath the surface worth accounting for. They saw the uniform, they heard him apologize. They did not look at his hands. "I understand," Harlow said, "but I want you to understand something too." His voice had not changed. It was still measured, still low. The voice of a man who has spent years deciding which things are worth saying. That instrument deserves to be played. Leaving it in the corner like a decoration, that's the disrespect. Reginald blinked. It was the blink of a man who had not been addressed that way in a very long time. "Excuse me? I said what I said." Harlow reached down and picked up the handle of his cart. "I'm sorry for overstepping. Good night, Mr. Asherton." He turned to go. and Reginald Asherton, in front of 260 people, reached out and put his hand on Harlow Dunn's shoulder and turned him back around. "No," Reginald said. "We're not done. You want to talk about disrespect? Walking into my event, in my hotel, sitting at a piano you have no business being near, that's disrespect. That's what happens when people don't understand their place." The room held its breath. Harlow looked at the hand on his shoulder. He looked at it for a long moment the way you look at something you want to remember accurately. Then he looked at Reginald Asherton's face. "Take your hand off me," Harlow said. "Quiet. Absolute. Please." Reginald did not take his hand off him. "You're done here," Reginald said. "Collect your things. Security will see you out." He said it loud enough for the room to hear. He said it the way men like him say things, as finality, as verdict, as the last word that will ever need to be spoken on any subject. He didn't know what the room knew that he didn't. He didn't know about the woman in the blue dress near the window. Camille Asherton's college friend, Diane Whitford, who had grown up in Memphis and who had spent 2 years, as a young woman, working as a volunteer concert coordinator, and who had, on a Tuesday night in October 30 years ago, stood in the wings of a concert hall and watched a 21-year-old man walk onto a stage and change the way she thought about what a human being could do. She was standing 6 feet away from the Steinway. She had recognized him in the first 30 seconds of his playing. She had not said anything yet because she was trying to determine if she was wrong, if time and distance had confused her, if the shock of the context had played tricks. But she wasn't wrong. She had never been wrong about this particular thing. She had a very specific gift for remembering extraordinary performances. She stepped forward. "Reginald." Her voice was the voice of someone who had known Reginald Asherton since before he was the third. It had a precision to it. "Do you know who that is?" Reginald did not look away from Harlow. "A member of my maintenance staff. His name," Diane Whitford said, "is Harlow Dunn." The name landed in the room the way certain names land, with a weight that has nothing to do with how many syllables it contains. A few people near the window heard it and started. A senator turned. The cabinet secretary, a woman who had sat on the board of the Kennedy Center for 12 years, set down her drink. Reginald Asherton heard none of this. He was still looking at Harlow. "That name means nothing to me," he said. "That's because you weren't listening," Diane Whitford said. She moved to stand beside Harlow, not touching him, not performing anything, just positioning herself in the way that women of a certain generation and a certain conviction position themselves when they have decided that something is worth the cost. Harlow Dunn performed at Carnegie Hall 4 times. He played a private concert for President Clinton's second inauguration. He was the featured soloist at the reopening of the New Orleans Symphony after Katrina. She paused. He was nominated for a Grammy in 2003. He won. The room did not make a sound. Reginald Asherton's hand was still on Harlow's shoulder. He took it off. There is a particular kind of silence that happens when a room of powerful people realizes it has been watching something it will need to account for. It isn't the silence of shock. It's more careful than that. More calculating. It's the silence of people deciding what they knew, and when, and whether they can say they were on the right side of something before the final word. 260 people settled into that silence on the 14th floor of the Asherton Grand Hotel. Harlow Dunn stood in the middle of it and felt something he had spent 11 months practicing not to feel. The specific grief of being seen by people who only saw you because they had been told to. He thought about his mother, who cleaned houses her whole life and never stopped teaching him the names of composers. Brahms, Harlow, Ravel. Say their names right. They belong to you too. He thought about the night he had decided to take the maintenance job, sitting in his car in a parking lot, looking at his hands and trying to remember who they used to belong to. What that had felt like. What it had cost him to walk in anyway and fill out the form and fold the version of himself he'd spent 30 years building into something that would fit in a gray uniform. He had told himself it was temporary. Everyone tells themselves it is temporary. The former cabinet secretary crossed the room. Her name was Eleanor Marsh, not the Eleanor Marsh from the file he had been shown by his attorney once, years ago, but a woman of that caliber, that particular blend of composed authority and genuine engagement that only exists in people who have been in rooms like this one their entire careers and have decided to use that access for something. She stopped in front of him. "Mr. Dunn," she said. I was at the Kennedy Center when you performed the Ravel Piano Concerto in G in 2004. She paused. I have been trying to remember the last time I heard anything as beautiful as what I just heard in the last 6 minutes. I don't think I can. Harlow Dunn looked at her for a moment. Thank you, he said. And then, because it was true and because he was a man who said true things, the piano needs tuning. The B-flat in the middle register is about 3 cents sharp. She laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one. Reginald Asherton had moved to the edge of the room. His wife was beside him. She was not looking at him. Camille Asherton was looking at Harlow Dunn, and her face held the expression of someone doing a very careful audit. Not of Harlow, of her husband. Of every decision that had constructed this moment. She had met Reginald when she was 26. She had watched him become, incrementally, the version of himself that was easiest to sustain in rooms like these. Certain, closed, entirely convinced that his opinion of a person was data rather than preference. She had loved him once the way you love someone before you understand what they will cost you. She still loved him. That was the honest answer. But love was not the same as agreement, and it was not the same as silence, and she had been silent for a very long time. She did not go to him. She went to the piano. She sat down on the bench and looked at the keys, and then she turned to where Harlow was still standing, surrounded now by people who wanted to speak to him, and she said, loudly enough that the room heard her, "Mr. Dunn, please finish what you started." The room moved back, not dramatically. The way a room moves when it is making space for something that has been decided. Harlow Dunn looked at Camille Asherton for a moment. He looked at the piano. He looked at his hands. He sat down. He did not start with the phrase he had been playing when Reginald interrupted him. He started somewhere else entirely. Something older, more formal, something that required the full range of the instrument. You could hear him finding the Steinway's particular voice in the first 4 bars, making adjustments the way a conversation partner adjusts when they are listening carefully. By the second page, they were in agreement. He played for 22 minutes. He played 3 pieces and an improvisation that moved from Chopin through something contemporary, and then back through the blues that Memphis had given him. The blues that his grandmother had hummed in her kitchen without knowing she was passing on the foundations of a musical tradition that would outlast everything she owned. He played like a man who had been quiet for a very long time and had found, unexpectedly, a room that was ready to hear him. When he finished, the room was absolutely still. Then it was not still. The applause was not the polite applause of an event where people clap because clapping is what you do. It was the other kind. The kind that means something happened here that I was not prepared for. Eleanor Marsh was on her feet first, then the senator near the window, then everyone else, and there is no graceful way to describe what it looks like when 260 people who spend most of their lives performing the correct emotional response to things find themselves, all at once, having an actual one. Harlow Dunn left the hotel at midnight. He had spoken to more people in those 2 hours than he had spoken to in the previous 11 months combined. He had given his number to Eleanor Marsh, who said she was calling her contact at the Chicago Symphony in the morning. He had shaken the hand of a man who ran an arts foundation and who looked at him with the particular intensity of someone doing math about how to fix something broken. He had promised nothing. He had said yes to very little. He had smiled when he needed to smile and been quiet when he needed to be quiet, which was the same skill he had always had. At the service entrance, Rosa, the young catering worker who had called him upstairs, was finishing the last of the cleanup. She looked up when he passed. "What happened up there?" she said. "A lot," Harlow said. "You okay?" He thought about it, which was, in itself, something, the fact that it required consideration. "I think I might be," he said. He walked out into the 9-degree night. The gold awning of the Asherton Grand said the same things it always said. The street was quiet. A cab moved past without stopping. Harlow Dunn stood on the sidewalk and held his hands up in front of him. Just for a moment, just long enough to look at them. The cold was already finding the joints in his fingers, the places where 30 years of playing had left its marks. He had a room that cost $420 a month in a building on the west side. He had a ceramic mug his daughter had given him, and a collection of 43 records that he had moved from apartment to apartment for 20 years, and a piano that existed only in the memory of his hands. He did not know, standing there, what the next thing would be. That was the honest truth, and he was a man who dealt in honest truths. He did not know if Eleanor Marsh's phone call would become anything. He did not know if Reginald Asherton's decision to terminate him would be reversed or fought or simply accepted. He did not know if the world that had opened up briefly on the 14th floor would close again, by morning the way worlds do. He knew his hands still worked. He knew that whatever had been taken from him, the stages, the contracts, the years of income that had dissolved in a dispute with a management company that had far better lawyers than he did, what had been taken was not the thing itself, not the core of it. The music had stayed. It had stayed in his hands through 11 months of mop handles and supply closets and mornings when getting up felt like a decision that had to be remade from scratch. It had stayed. He put his hands in his pockets and started walking. 3 days later, Eleanor Marsh called. The Chicago Symphony had a gap in their spring program. A soloist had canceled. The artistic director, a woman who had followed Harlow's career from its beginning and had believed for years that something had gone wrong that shouldn't have, said yes before the conversation was finished. Harlow Dunn performed at Symphony Center on a Thursday evening in March. The house was full. The program listed his name the way it used to be listed, before everything, in the font reserved for headliners, with a biography that ran 4 full paragraphs and included the Grammy and the Kennedy Center and the 4 Carnegie Hall performances and the inaugural concert and 17 other facts about a life that had not gone away simply because it had gone quiet. Reginald Asherton did not attend. His wife did. Camille Asherton sat in the 3rd row and did not look at her phone once during the entire 90-minute program. Afterward, she went backstage and waited in a line of 15 people until it was her turn to stand in front of the man her husband had fired in his own hotel. She said, "I'm sorry for all of it." Harlow looked at her for a moment. "Thank you for asking me to finish the piece," he said. "That mattered." She nodded. She shook his hand. She left before she started crying, which was a decision, and she had always been a woman of decisions. The reviews ran the next morning. 3 publications. 2 of them led with the comeback narrative, which was the story they knew how to tell. The third, a music critic named Daniel Osei, who had been covering classical performance in Chicago for 20 years and who did not traffic in redemption arcs when there was actual music to discuss, wrote 400 words about technique and interpretation and the specific way Harlow Dunn understood silence as a compositional element, the way he treated the space between notes as deliberately as the notes themselves. He wrote, "There are pianists who play what is written. There are pianists who play what is meant. Harlow Dunn plays what is true. That is an extremely rare thing, and we nearly lost it. The fact that we didn't is not a story about a comeback. It is a story about what survives." That piece was shared 11,000 times by the end of the week. Harlow did not see most of the sharing. He was not by nature a man who monitored what the world said about him. He had learned, in the years when the world had said mostly nothing, that the only reliable thing was the work itself, the practice, the listening, the daily decision to be the kind of musician who still had something to say. He had kept that decision even when he was mopping floors. Especially when he was mopping floors. The morning after the concert, he called his daughter in Atlanta. She picked up before the second ring, which meant she had been waiting, which meant she already knew. "Dad," she said. "Hey, baby. I read the reviews." "Yeah." A pause. The kind between people who know each other well enough that silence is a form of conversation. "Are you okay?" she said. What she meant was, "Are you really okay?" Not the okay you say to people when you don't want them to worry, but the real thing. Harlow Dunn sat in the one good chair in his apartment in the thin morning light coming through the window that faced west, in the room with the 43 records and the ceramic mug and the hands that remembered everything. "Yeah," he said, "I really am." And that was the truth. Not the ending of anything. Not the closing of a chapter. Just a man on a Thursday morning in March, telling his daughter something that was finally simply true, that the thing in him that mattered had not, in the end, been lost, had not been taken, had waited quietly, in the same place it had always been, the way real things wait.